Call to order a work session, Goodyear City Council, Monday, November 16th. All items listed are for discussion only. No action can or will be taken. Is this on?
I don't think so. None of these are on. Jeff?
But we have two members missing this evening, and they'll be properly excused during the regular meeting. But one is ill, Mr. Souza, and the other is a business to attend to this evening, and that's Mr. Antoniak. So we'll excuse them when time comes. We have two items on our agenda, and the first one is concerns the senior scientific citizen satisfaction survey, and then the other one is on art ordinance. So we'll start with Paula Alardo.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. At a previous council work session, the council and citizens questioned the $20,000 cost of doing a 20-minute random telephone questionnaire with a professional company, as we have done in the past two surveys. It was suggested at that time that methods other than telephone might be better and cheaper, and that citizens could do the interviewing to save money. The sample size of 400 was also questioned as to whether it was large enough to be reliable. At the same time, members of council said that they wanted to be sure that they were getting a scientific survey so they could be assured that the results were accurate and valid. So as a result of all those different possibilities, I thought the best thing to do would be to bring a known market research expert to discuss the advantages and disadvantages of the various research methodologies, to explain the reliability of sample sizes, and to talk about the interviewing process and how important it is to achieving accurate results. Dr. Michael O'Neill, who's with us this evening, founded O'Neill Research in Tempe and has over 35 years of experience in designing, conducting, and analyzing opinion research projects. He's overseen over 1,700 projects for a wide range of clients, including the nation's largest corporations, law firms, unions, hospitals, various federal, state, county, and city agencies, and educational institutions, including universities. As a former researcher myself, I can tell you that if you were to ask the world's leading survey practitioners to name the two dominant scientific survey centers on the planet, only two names would dominate: the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago and the Survey Research Center at the University of Michigan. Dr. O'Neill's training in survey research includes significant work at both. He did his graduate work at the Opinion Research Center at Chicago and his postdoctorate at the Research Center at the University of Michigan. He's also been appointed to the faculty at the University of Michigan, the University of Illinois, and Northwestern University, and was the founding director of the Public Opinion Research Program at ASU before starting his own firm in 1981. Listed in Who's Who in America, he's a Phi Beta Kappa honors graduate of Brown University, where he also holds a master's degree in sociology. His PhD is from Northwestern University. So he's kindly come here tonight to explain market research methodology, sampling, and interviewing, and after that, he'll open it up to any questions that you have. Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you. I understand we've got 30 minutes. I can talk for maybe half of it and then let you have at me with anything that piques anybody's mind. Paula asked me to come here. I've known and respected her for years, and there's few things in life as powerful as being asked to do something by somebody you respect. I have no vested interest in any outcome here other than, as somebody who's studied and practiced the art and science of public opinion research for decades, I'd like to see it done well. I've asked her only one thing. I'm in the process of writing a book on research principles and how people buy public opinion research and some of the fallacies that they make. It's rich in war stories and anecdotes. And I understand this will be audio recording, and there may be some grist for material here. If I do, I use it. I promise you nobody's name goes into it. It'll be made very generic. There are many misperceptions about opinion research that brought me here, and these are not unique to city government or even government. There's none of the kinds of things that Paula just alluded to that I haven't heard hundreds of times over. Let me just say a few words that kind of put this in context. what I call the characteristics of opinion research as it relates to a lot of these questions. One, there is a widespread belief, well, anybody can do this. Look, we're just asking questions, and every one of us does this every day. You ask a few questions, you get answers, and then you know what people think. It's a reasonable enough thing to understand because it is in our everyday experience. The truth is, however, opinion research done over large numbers of people is simple only to the extent that you don't know much about it. The more and more you know, the more difficult it gets to do. In fact, that's what graduate training is. It doesn't tell you very much about how to do it. It just acquaints you with thousands and thousands of pitfalls of things that you can't do. And most people, by the end of the graduate school, they often almost reach the, well, how can I get anything done? Well, that is an appropriate context because what you really want to do, above all else, is avoid making a mistake. But it's a paradox in that if you don't know very much, you just go out and just ask some questions and take them at face value and think that you have the answer. Let me start with a small example. And you wouldn't have this if you're one-on-one. You can ask, if you were to be asking a question of a citizen, say, how do you feel about this? And they were to ask you, well, what do you mean by that? What would you do? I think most of you would reasonably enough try to explain the question, okay? Well, if you're doing a broad-based survey, the problem with that, in doing what makes imminent sense to you, is that you have, say, 20 interviewers asking questions. You have 20 different answers to the question, so you no longer know what the question was. It was an amalgamation of what interviewers gave in the way of responses. And so one of the things that we train people, and believe me, it's difficult because it's completely counterintuitive, is to tell them under no circumstances do you define anything. And we feel so strongly about that because we know that once you open up that door, that you no longer know what we feel so strongly that if that means in an individual instance that we're going to even pass on the question, then we would rather do that than get answered to something where we don't know what the question was. I'll get back to that point in a minute about dealing with volunteer interviews and if I don't, remind me. So following what's a common sense rule in this instance leads to bad research because we don't get the transcript of everything. We get tabulated numbers. Characteristic number 2, there is a body of knowledge. Despite popular belief, the only place that body of knowledge is treated seriously is in a handful of places in some graduate programs in the social sciences. You can spend years doing it. You can spend decades doing it. Characteristic number 3, however, is that the field is unregulated. Anybody can hang a shingle and proclaim competency in this area. I've got mixed feelings about that one. While I'd like recognized competency measurement, I personally doubt that it would ever be enforced enough to be meaningful. In fact, there was one professional organization that started a certification program about 2 years ago. And the first thing they did was to grandfather everybody who's in it. So if they take their work seriously, maybe in 30 years it'll mean something, but until then it's a joke. So in this sense, we're probably more analogous to a journalist than a doctor. You can have a good journalist. You can also have a sort of random blogger who violates every precept of good reporting. And the problem for us as a profession is, probably not unlike some journalists, we tend to get defined more by the latter than the former. So characteristics, again, most people think anybody can do it. There is, however, body knowledge, but there's a lot about the structure, the way the profession is set up, that leads people to believe that there isn't. There is a tendency, and I understand the fact of budgetary shortfalls and problems is not an unknown. I was telling Paula before, yesterday I was running an HOA meeting where I've been drafted to be HOA president. I fortunately happened to be in office rather than a home because you get less of the people with lots of time on their hands to do with it. And can we economize? Can we economize? And everybody's hurting. But there are things where you can, and there are things you can only at great peril. Can you do your own accounting? After all, we have Quicken. Can you diagnose your own disease when we have WebMD? Can you do CAD/CAM, and fire your architect? Well, these are all tools. They all have a place, and they all might even be able to cut some cost, but they're no substitute for expertise. But one of the things I heard about is, well, what about the interviewing part? Let me walk through real quickly. In any research project, you've got about 5 components that are going to be common to any project. One is you have the design, writing and drafting questions, focusing on what you want to do. Number 2, pull a sample. Pull it in a way that's representative of the population. If we just get people who are not representative of the entire town of Goodyear, then it doesn't add up to anything. If you want, whatever the number is, whether it's 100 or 500 or 1,000 or even 5,000, if it's not representative of the larger population, it's not of much use to you. Third part is to actually collect the data. In survey research, we call this the field. It actually had agricultural origins, but it's interviewing. Or data collection by paper and pencil. It's when you collect the data. Fourth is tabulation, which is a relatively mechanical process. And the fifth is analysis, which is making sense of it. I think that the suggestion that, well, can't we save money by doing the interviewing, had some limited validity in the extent, if I were forced to name one of these items, that one could, more than the other, with less risk, pull out and try to do with people who are less trained, it probably would be that part. But let me focus on what some of the issues are with that, and then I'll say something about sample representativeness too. Or let me deal with sample representativeness first. It's the question of, say, telephone. Can't we do this over the internet? The issue is twofold. One is, can you get a list of all, implicit or explicit, a list of all persons who live within the town? On a telephone basis, you can do this because it's in known telephone prefixes. And you get unlisted people, which is a very significant number, up to 40%. By putting random digits after the original prefix, you then screen for geography, you screen for business. You can end up with a rep. There is no such equivalent list on the internet. The other thing that comes to play is, think of how many pieces of email you get in a day. An internet survey goes out with an invitation. Even if you had a list to begin with, unless people have a compelling reason to respond, it's just so easy to hit the delete. You're going to get back less than 1%. And it's not about the numbers, it's about the representativeness. Doing stuff by telephone has become increasingly difficult over the last 10 years. Respondent resistance is massively higher than it ever was, but it's not of the same order of magnitude as you get over the internet. So that's the issue of online and telephone. It has to do with reaching a representative sample. Let me say a few things about the issue of interviewers. One of the things you got to do is train them, and I gave you an illustration of one of the kind of things that people can even fall into. Let me tell you what happens when you've trained people and you've told them not to do that, and they go on the phone. What they do? They ignore it. They do what makes common sense. You've got to be there. You've got, just sort of, if you ask somebody to do something that doesn't make sense to them, just telling them isn't going to do it. You have to reinforce it constantly. So it's not just a one-time, don't do this, don't. You could come up with a list of do's and don'ts, which we do, but you have to stay on it. And so what people get better. So what happens is over time, you have to get people to retreat from normal human, behaviors that make sense in everyday conversation that don't make here. I will tell you, I have over the years, not often, but occasionally attempted to do situations with volunteer interviews. I'll tell you what is more typical. You say, well, all right, we need to set a block of time, a serious block of time for training, at least to expose people to principles, even though we may not be able to reinforce it, at least several hours. We need people to come in. You get 40 people who say they'll show. And we have to start on time because everybody has to see the song. You get promises from 40 people. You're there at the appointed time. 3 show, 2 leave early. A few people wander in after that. And then let's think about what happens with the motivated at that point. First of all, this is hard work because you're going to call somebody up and they're not going to be all friendly and happy to talk to you. It's who are you? What's this about? I'm busy. Are you selling something? You're going to encounter a lot of rejection. Well, that's hard enough to deal with people, and most of the people we hire on this quit quick because they can't take it. But when people aren't being paid, let's take that a step further. It's unpleasant, and you're not being paid, and you thought it was going to be a fun civic activity. The other concern and let me tell you about there was one instance where we had decent success with this. We had a project we were doing, and our volunteer interviewers were all physicians. And we started to sit them down in training, and they said, I started to talk to them and say, look, we're all doctors, we're real smart, we don't need this, can't we just do it? And I said, let me stay at it. Well, 3 hours later, the light bulbs are going off, and they say, oh, okay, now I get it. Now I know why and they're still peppering me with questions. So, the other concern I'd have with volunteer situations is that one of the things that's most important in doing a survey and asking the questions is that everybody say absolutely standard. My fear in a situation of volunteer on topic of public is concerned is that you might get self-selection of people with an axe to grind, and they're going to find it very difficult to keep their opinions out, no matter what they are. I mean, ideally, you'd like to have somebody who wants to save the city some money and good government, whatever. But in practice, this is a treacherous business. There's a lot of rejection. And there's also a lot of boredom. I mean, you get people not at home answering machines. You make a lot of calls to get one. And then try repeat calling back when you've called somebody before because you don't want to get just the self-selection. It's not easy. And other than that doctor situation, the only situation of so-called volunteer I can recall where we ever got the bodies in there was a political campaign back east, and it turned out that I was talking to all these people who were so-called volunteers, and turns out they were all employees of another congressional office who were told to show up. So it was military volunteer. Because I was impressed. I said, my God, you've got a room full. They're all here on time. How did you pull this off? So, there are, and I think you're already committed, but there's a comment one could make about, there are reasons why, times where it doesn't make sense to do opinion research. Most prominently, if you're not interested in hearing the opinions. I mean, that's not without some validity. The classic quote on this is Edmund Burke, who said, your representative owes you not only his industry, but his judgment. He betrays that by serving you if he sacrifices this for your opinion. I would take the position that it would be equal folly to ignore public opinion, and it would be to blindly follow it. I mean, I can tell you some examples. My favorite old story was a case years ago from Dayton, Ohio, and they asked people what they thought some of the problems. One of the things that came up was there's not enough police downtown. They went to the chief, and they, show us the manpower and all that. And the chief said, look, we've got saturation patrolling here. It doesn't make any sense. But to me, the solution, however, I think was a wonderful example of it. But we have a problem. The public wants to feel safe. They don't feel safe. They had meter maids who weren't in uniform. They put them in uniform. 2 years later, they went back and surveyed again. And people at that point reported they felt very good about the level of police presence. In other words, there are facts that you have at your disposal that the public doesn't. But public perception is in and of itself a value that I think you want to maximize. But it's a mistake always. You don't take that at face value. That means we got to do this. If people, however, say there's a problem in this area, that means something ought to be done, not necessarily the solution that they propose, because sometimes that involves, I mean, the classic one is things like, oh, well, should we do, left turn lagging left turn on lights or whatever. To me, that's a traffic engineering issue. What people want is good traffic flow. They may have some notions about how to produce it. Those notions can be wrong, and that's why you hire a traffic engineer. The other point I'd think about this, and the reason why I think this kind of work is a great benchmark, is that while public meetings sold a wonderful function, they are not representative of the broader population. They're at best representative of those people who feel strongly about something. That might be a developer, that might be a neighborhood that's going to be impacted by development. In my experience, and a lot of stuff in this community, when you talk transportation stuff, if you only held public meetings, you would conclude that bike paths were the number one issue that the community face. And it is a well-organized group, but when I go out on the street, I don't see that many bikers. But if you go to the public meetings, you'd get a different impression. I think both of those have a role. One measures intensity, but when somebody comes in here and says they represent the whole world, that should be taken with a grain of salt. They might not. Those are my broad observations, and I'd be sample size. Yes, okay. Is 400 enough? First comment about that: way too much importance is put on. I mean, if you don't have something that's well designed, administrated in an even-handed fashion, tabulated competently, and interpreted well, you don't have anything. What will sample size get you? Any given sample size, if all of those other conditions are met. Like, for example, representative sample. You go to the internet, you can get 10 million. It doesn't necessarily mean anything. 400 gets you plus, or, if it's done in a random fashion, gets you plus or minus 5%. 700 gets you, 500 gets you plus or minus 4%. 700 gets you down to about 3. 1,000 gets you plus or minus about 2. The main reason for numbers over 400 or so are that when you want to look at subgroups, like I understand in your analysis, you break down the town into 3.
North, middle, and south.
Well, what matters is how many, if you're driving an estimate for north and there's 100 people in north, then the plus or minus for that is 10%, because the basis of that is 100. Doesn't matter how many there were in other areas that you're not estimating. So the thing that drives sample size is most often what's the smallest unit that we want to analyze, what's the largest margin of error we can tolerate for that group. And then if we can't get that, then we got to take another look at budget, because it's the intersection of, small. We might like it by zip code, but there's too many zip codes and there's small groups, but we'd need a sample of 2,000 to get that. I often hear that, well, give me results for zip codes. And I said, well, how big's your checkbook? Because if you got a lot of zip codes, if 400 is plus or minus 5% in the town, and you want one zip code and you want it plus or minus 5%, we need 400 in that. So that's how much precision do you want to buy. So bottom line with all this, I think it's like many other things. It's not what you don't know that hurts you. It's what you don't know that ain't so, or what you do know that ain't so. If you're going to do it right. Be careful. And the numbers, more sample, buy you more precision. But you're balancing a lot of things, and we also heard a lot of, sort of cost-saving strategy. And the other thing about that, too, is, plus for attitudinal questions, plus or minus 5% is a pretty comfortable range for me, because the questions are not precise. We're dealing with words and human beings, and there's an imperfection in that level of understanding. If we could get something down to 4 level of decimal places, I'm not sure that we're getting any really deeper understanding. The limiting factor about 400 is if you want to get into smaller and smaller groups, you got to understand you don't have the same precision for those groups. So that's what I have to say, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have.
All right. Councilmember Osborne.
I don't know that I have any questions right now. I think you definitely hit upon our scientific thought, huh, Joe? And that was very good. I appreciate your input on that. Thank you.
Actually, I was one of those that said, oh, I can do this, and I was one of those that just, we don't need to hire that, we don't need to spend money. But I had an interviewer call me this week. What timing? And it was obviously from the U.S. government, because it was over our exchange system in the military. And you could tell that this young man was a professional interviewer, because I ranted and raved and went on one. And he brought me back to that same question each time, until finally he said, I guess you don't have an answer, and then I would answer him. But he controlled me, and I'm hard to control.
He's sitting there, and if it's what we call a closed-ended question, they've got 4 answers. You can talk, but unless they're asking an open-ended question, in which case they're going to try to write down every word you say. If it's a closed-ended question, we want to know, is this excellent, good, fair, or poor, or is this how strong, whatever that is. Anything other than that is extraneous.
All of my criticisms to light.
Yep.
Made me eat my words. And at the end of it, I told him how well he did at this, because he was really challenged. And I don't know if I could have responded and done as well as he performed it. So I sort of reversed my opinion of this.
The sad comment I'd make is you encountered somebody who was very good. Not everybody trains people that well, and I play those games too to see what people will do, and sometimes I get appalled.
Yeah, just a couple quick ones. On the sample size, or on the sample itself, I assume, and again, I know what assume does, is that from a demographic standpoint, how do you make sure that, I assume you're looking at age, location, maybe educational background, a variety of things, so you get a diverse group within this 400?
Actually, that's the result, but you don't look at that. You rely on the method to get you there, okay? This is what larger numbers in the hundreds do. It's sort of like, I want to determine the coin's balanced. I flip it 400 times. I'm going to get about 200 hits. I might get 198. It's going to come in close. If the method allows everybody in the town to have an equal probability of being selected, then all those demographics will naturally flow out unless there's some differential response. So the primary focus is on the method, because a lot of times those parameters aren't known ahead of time. And if you start monkeying with that, it's very easy to be accused of, you're trying to jerry-rig the data by pulling in more of this group or that group. But so the concern is well taken, but it's mostly an adherence to probability sampling, which is proven to be, it's proven to work. If you get large enough numbers, I'm obviously simplifying some issue. If you get everybody in the list, you pull them randomly, and that's easy. That can be done by computer and random generation, unless there's some huge issue of differential response where some group. Now, how do you deal with that? Some groups are easier to get a hold of than others. You don't just make one call. You make multiple calls to non-responding households. If somebody's busy, you find out when a time would be to call them back, that sort of thing. At the end of which, you want to have a situation where you end up with a random microcosm. And for most things, certainly for attitudinal things, we have no basis to go on. You can look at the end to see, is there some gross thing here? Is this in some respect difference from other, but what data are you going to compare that to? Your census here is 10 years old. It may very well be that this method may, for some items, give you a better measure than anything else. Unless you have a list where you have known parameters. For example, if you're surveying your employees, you might have age distribution to begin with. And then you have something is the correct, and then you could compare it to that. And you could say if there's a modest difference here, then maybe you could select to control for that. But to do that, you have to have a known parameter. And with something like a town 10 years out from a census, and a census is itself, another survey. It's just a far more expensive, extensive survey.
We have used it to learn what the education level is and age and that kind of thing in the sample.
Yeah, and I would also, from a professional standpoint, I think probably defining the question is key. And that's where, in my opinion, the experience of a professional who does this for a living makes sure that you have a question. Again, I know you can't define the question, but you want the questions written, I would assume, in a way where people would understand what you're trying to get to.
Absolutely.
As opposed, I may write a question in which I think this is what I am asking, but maybe it's not really.
Well, in fact, let me return to the point I made earlier about you ask a question and somebody doesn't, know what and they ask you to interpret it. If that happens more than a very small percentage of the time, you have a bad question. And part of the process of design is to do pretest and to listen for that and to fix questions. So if this happens very often, more than a relatively small percentage of the time, you have a bad question that you're not going to be able to make any sense out of. And I would rather throw out a question than produce numbers on something that are meaningless. But the main approach to that one is preventative. It's up front, working on the questions. A lot of times people say, well, you're not you expert, you've done this a lot, you can write. Good. The people who have done this a lot and know how to do it know that you can never do that. There's a whole lot of stuff that I can improve on from years of experience, but one of the things that you learn is you test everything, because it's this quote at the end, it's what you don't know that gets you. And very often it's something like a frame of reference. I remember about 30 years ago, we did something there was the first project I ever did in the Valley for Phoenix Police. And we were, our frame of reference was, what kinds of topics would you like to see police to focus on? And the question was worded, what areas would you like to see police to see more effort? And we're thinking robbery, burglary, and the answers came back South Phoenix. We had the wrong frame of reference, and you ask a few questions and listen to some answers, and you realize, okay, well, I thought I was asking about type of crime, but it got interpreted as geographical area.
And
You learn that by doing.
we might ask,
I follow. That's why I wanted.
we might have a list of questions like our services. There might be 20 on that list. We will rotate that list among the people we ask. So the first one isn't first for everyone, in case, they rate higher as they go and then they get tired and they would change it.
That's another. And if it's done by computer, usually it'll completely randomize
Right.
it. Not just rotate the start, but randomize the order, because sometimes there's a fatigue factor or there's a context factor. You asked about a whole lot of high priority things, and then you get something else, and it gets slammed unnecessarily low. What you do by randomizing the order is to control across that.
You answered my questions. I appreciate it. Thanks.
Frank, do you have any comment?
Yeah, just a couple questions. One on design. When designing this instrument, is there a way to test it? Is there a way to test before it goes out to the population or to that sample population?
Yeah.
So that you know that none of these problems.
Yeah, well, what you do is you do actual interviews that don't count, and you listen in on them, and you record and listen, and then you have a debriefing session with interviews. Okay, this question one at a time. Did anybody, when you're asking this question, did anybody say anything? Did anybody ask you what it meant? Was there any resistance? Was there any and you listen, and you.
So you do a sample first, though,
Yeah.
so that you have
Yeah.
a design that is as flawless as possible.
Because you write
The pretest.
It's a pretest. Yeah. You try to get it right. There are things because you've done it before, and certain kinds of things don't work. But then there's always can always be stuff that just doesn't.
Do you use a sample of the population to do that?
Ideally, yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Not the
And then you
same.
don't use that equivalent, but not identical.
Equivalent.
Different people that are equivalent. Yes.
Okay.
In particular, with reference, if there's anything you overemphasize, it's less educated population, if you have the ability to do that, because most of the questions, the problems you come in, get into comprehension.
And then on your analysis, when you're doing your analysis of this, you've got all your information in. Now, the results of your analysis are what? Are they trends? Are they the actual
Well,
needs?
In this instance, my understanding is you're tracking something that's done before, and that's when this gets really valuable.
Partly.
Because the stuff that you track, and this is where you have to make a tough call. I've just said you want to make the questions good, right? But if you want to track stuff, you can't change it, not even to improve it, you know? If so, you have you say, we think we have a problem with this question, you have a choice. You can keep it the same, or you can start a new time series. You can't change a question. You can't compare a question on which you have changed a word. But I will say this, tracking stuff is when this is going to be, because if I were to tell you that the satisfaction with such and such a department is 70%, well, is that good or bad? If you knew that 2 years before it was 60%, you would think differently about that than if you knew 2 years before it was 80. The other thing I will tell you in municipal surveys is that, frankly, some departments get rated higher easier. So you can compare across departments, but that's to some extent unfair, because I'll tell you, in almost every city survey I've ever seen, the fire department comes out number one. Why? Well, they perform a rather critical service. It's almost unlike police service, which can sometimes be contentious. It's all warm and fuzzy and doing good stuff. Okay, so the standard is different. You know,
They have pretty trucks and all that, yeah.
We have 100 questions on our questionnaire, and 2/3 of them are repeats, and 1/3 of them are new issues every year.
And so, but we're not talking about that tonight, correct? Right.
But you mean what's on the questionnaire? No.
So we're going to save that for another work session, or are we going to save that?
We do that internally and send all the questions around to council and staff
Okay.
and get your input and ask you what questions you want on, et cetera.
Good, Frank?
But do you come back and be honest about it if the question, I mean, because if you ask the wrong question, so, because we're council people.
Basically, we say, what's the topic you want covered, not how do you want, what's the question you want answered?
All right, that makes me feel better, yeah.
I have mine written right now.
We need to get on to another meeting. Just one last comment. And I appreciate you coming, by the way. But you said that when you do break your survey into segments, that the level of accuracy decreases somewhat. So if you were 5% with 400 in one group,
Right.
you'd be substantially less with 2 or 3 groups, with still 400 total.
Well, yeah, because if you're looking at the accuracy for a group, it's the sample size in that group that matters.
So usually when we analyze the data, if we, knowing that we have about 130 per, say, north, south, and central, if we see a big difference there that's over 8 to 10%, then we usually bring it up to you and say, here's what the city said, but we had a skew in this area. We seldom have analyzed it a lot, every question on by the area of the city. We do some on age. I mean, the age, we will see a skew, say, on what they read or mount on internet and things like that. If you see that big difference of 10%, then you know that there's a skew based upon your population.
But it's important that you, when you talk about the 5% or whatever level of accuracy, that you also express that it in fact isn't that when you segmentize. So that needs to be expressed, and I don't think that came out before, frankly.
And that means when you're looking at, say, the 3 areas of town,
Yeah.
you need a pretty big difference before you can detect it. If you've got 2 areas and they're 5% apart, you don't know that that's real. You need to be 10, 12%.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Do you live here? Do you live in Tempe? You work with ASU?
Once in a while.
Well, thanks for coming. Thank you, Paula.
Thank you.
Here, you want
Thank you.
that to Paula? That's my list.
Appreciate it.
Okay, we now have, we'll move to art, and I think Diane Cripe is going to lead that one off.
My
Evening, Mayor, members of council. Thank you so much for allowing us the time to discuss clarifying the current percent for art ordinance. First of all, the history and the timeline. As you all know, in April of 2006, City Council approved the percent for art ordinance, establishing also at the same time an Arts and Culture Commission. And in October of 2007, the Arts and Culture Commissioners were appointed and seated. Based on this ordinance, the ordinance allocates up to 1% of the construction cost of eligible capital expenditures for public art. Also, the Arts Commission recommends annual public art plan. The council annually reviews the public art plan and sets the budget. And at this point, we're here because the final approval of each art project concept is unclear based on the ordinance. We have several members of our Arts and Culture Commission here this evening. Brenda Bernardi is here, who is the chair, and also we have Alex Colai and Ed Bonvecchio. All members of the Arts and Culture Commission are residents of Goodyear. We have 7 standing members. We also have an alternate and an ex officio member who represents the West Valley Arts Council. Thank you. Brenda?
So currently the role of the Arts and Culture Commission is to develop and recommend policies and priorities for the public art program. We seek to build partnerships with public and private organizations to promote the arts as a tool for economic development and cultural tourism by attending city events, being well connected within the arts and culture community, attending public meetings, and the like. Encouraging citizen involvement through educational programming. We recently started a hot coffee series to talk about public art in Goodyear. We've also attended a couple of the GAIN events and encouraged citizen participation through that. Advocating for the visual and performing arts, arts education, and other initiatives. We've been involved in some of our own public surveys, also encouraging citizens to communicate with you personally and via email about the budgeting process and their own personal value of the arts.
Okay, the current approval process for artwork is, and this gives you a broad overview of how we go about once we've decided on the public art plan. We have a local as well as national call to artists. The next step is we assemble a panel to select that artist, and the panel always includes an arts commissioner, member of staff who is associated with the project, and arts professionals. Once that artist is selected, then has been vetted, we've researched references and so forth, then the Arts and Culture Commission approves the artist, and then it goes to City Council to approve the contract with the artist. Then we enter the design phase of the public art project. The artist always attends a public meeting, meets with staff, and encourages public input at the very creation of the design. Then the artist comes back for a second public meeting to present a concept and get feedback from both staff and the public. With this feedback, the artist will revise the concept if that's necessary, and once the concept is reviewed, it is approved by the Arts and Culture Commission.
So rather than having you do some exercises to create your own artwork tonight or to do some interpretive dance, we thought we'd just give you some examples examples of the current projects or the past projects. So, of course, our first project was the historic Goodyear street sign toppers. We really wanted to show some respect for that community, being the first community here in Goodyear. We had, if I recall correctly, 30 to 40 people in attendance at the celebration to unveil those street sign toppers. Next was the Western Avenue Art Bench. Of course, that grand opening just took place. I think that we had a really good attendance throughout the whole process of creating these benches, from the citizen input all the way through to the creation. We have a couple different examples of those. And you can... And then, of course, our national award winner, the Ziz, did receive an award through Americans for the Arts, and we also I believe the ballpark marketing materials have won some national awards as well, and I think that the Ziz is featured pretty prominently in all of those materials, so we're pretty proud of that. The Fire Station 185 has had two or three public meetings, has had some great input from our fire chief all the way down to citizens of Pebble Creek and beyond. And then the Public Works Water Resources Building. The artist has actually. I like this. This has had some really great feedback from the public. Now, the meeting itself had a low attendance, but those people who were there had some really good feedback for the artist. I'm really excited about the idea that there's, if you want to move one more slide, there's actually three components to this project. So there would be the sculpture on the previous slide. This is a little hard to see three-dimensionally, but it is actually a shade structure so that the employees of the building can come out and enjoy their veranda. And then there's also a mural. We don't have a picture of that one. But so there's three components to that particular project.
Okay, what do other Arizona cities do in terms of approving the final concept? All the cities, I took a casual, basically talked to a few people who run public art programs in various cities, the ones that you see listed here. All the cities require an Arts Commission input and citizen input and whole public meetings. And then it's fairly evenly split in terms of who has the final approval, whether it's the Arts Commission on the left or the City Council, which is the column on the right. So we have a recommendation.
Our current recommendation is that you move forward with having the Arts and Culture Commission to give final approval on the public art concept. That, of course, City Council would approve the artist contract, approve our annual art appropriation, and receive notification of all public meetings and yellow paper for all art projects.
Pros of doing it this way is the council appoints a commission that represents a diverse demographic of the city. The Arts Commission actively seeks input from the public all along the process of the public art project. Arts Commission is experienced and knowledgeable in that area. This allows City Council to focus on policy. Council will continue to receive information about the art projects by attending public meetings and also through yellow papers. The con is that the council would abdicate art project approval to the Arts Commission.
So, of course, the next step would be to amend the percent for art ordinance in January of 2010 to clarify the final approval process.
Any questions?
Okay, let's start on this side this time.
Do we, when it comes to selecting the artist, do we put any preference for local artists, what I mean, Goodyear artists, in this process? I mean, do we try our best to try to get
We
Goodyear
definitely,
artists?
yeah, we definitely give out the call to artists to a lot of local input. So we try to get as many Arizona artists as possible to apply for projects. And at that point, if it came down to a choice between two artists and one was an Arizona artist and one was a non, it would go to the Arizona artist. We also have an Art in Public Civic Spaces program where we always try and show West Valley artists in City Hall. And it just depends on the project and the artist selection panel. We do not give them specific direction to select an Arizona artist, but we do let them know that we want to encourage emerging artists.
So we really haven't had that many that have come forward.
That's correct.
Because there was some criticism in the paper on that, but we do throw out the invitation and
Right.
but they're not coming forward, so.
Well, follow up to that. Do we ever have, and again, being new to this process, do we ever have a forum in which we try to get artists to display their wares type of thing, in which they come forward to kind of show what kind of artwork they do? Do you do any sponsors along those lines as to try to get the message out who some of these Goodyear artists may be?
Just through the Art and Civic Spaces program, and that's both two-dimensional artwork as well as three-dimensional. We have a display case for objects. The next exhibition we're going to have in the display case will be wood art. We've had gourd art, and then the others are two-dimensional paintings and so forth.
But it hasn't been a forum with multiple artists. So there's 2 to 3 artists each time. We change out the artwork every 2 to 3 months. So it gives a variety of local artists a chance throughout the year, but not one large one.
I'm just looking for a forum in which we can kind of promote local artists, you know, here in Goodyear to try to maybe get a leg up on some of the stuff. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, just I want to carry that a little further. A lot of time, local artists, and I know several here in the community, that do not want to be known as artists in the community because there is typically a problem with criticism of local artists, and they're available to the local public, and they don't want to be. So you're going to find that. In fact, you've got local artists here who are internationally known, but you don't even know who they are. We don't know. I keep meeting these people on a periodic basis, and their material is, and they're renowned internationally, but they do not make much show in Goodyear. Paulo Solari is one of those type of individuals. He lived in Scottsdale, 3 blocks from the school I taught in, and he still lives there, as a matter of fact. No one there knew him. They didn't know who he was. One of the greatest architects in the world, and he's got the Arcosante up here, but his infamous or famous, he's famous internationally as one of the great architects, yet locally hardly known. And I think you'll find that that's the desire of a lot of artists. They just really don't want to be, they don't want to display their stuff and locally. Let me ask you, in selecting art, do you use the artist criteria of all the elements that make an art form to, does that come into play when you're selecting an artwork?
Yes, in each of the panels that I've participated in, we did have criteria that we were looking for, and it's specific to the project. When Diane selects the panelists, she will have a couple of people who are experts in the public art field so that they'll be able to ask those kinds of questions. So while some of the panelists will be members of the community that they're representing, there will always be someone with an expertise in public art representing those questions.
That way we don't have to put up with dragonflies and butterflies. Is that what that is out there? I'm sorry.
Councilmember Osborne?
You know, I was thinking back that when I was on planning and zoning, before we had an arts commission, it went from planning and zoning to council just over the art in the medians and our welcome signs, our first kind of stab at art, and that was before the commission. And I know that council kind of had that final word, but we didn't have necessarily a real expert at the table, like you're saying, of, you know, here's what we're looking at, here's how we think about it. And I think you've done a fabulous job in getting the public input. Whether they come or not, it's there. They're given the opportunity. So I've been very pleased at how you've done it. And I'm not going to say that I'm any better expert at art than someone else, because it's all in our own eyes. And bringing it back to the 7 of us and saying, okay, you know, which one, everybody's going to... It's going to be tough. I guess, you know, when you talk commission, you sit there and you think of planning and zoning. Planning and zoning is a commission, but they're a recommending body. So the question is that you're coming to us is, it's an arts commission. Are we still recommending and you're getting the final say, or are you letting us do that job? So that's, at the end of the day, is what you're asking, isn't it? To clarify that. I think I guess I'd give it to you myself.
Vice Mayor?
You know, I really don't at this point have any comment. I've been very pleased with what the commission has done. A thought did come to mind that when the city develops certain areas, maybe they have sort of a tone or a look they want to do. And as long as I would be assured that the commission, that we would have input to give to the commission, then they would then interpret that and come up with an art project. That's my only comment.
Welcome it.
Okay, it doesn't sound like there's any objection to the authority for approving concept to being at the commission level. Well, council would still approve of the funding of it, correct? Does that agree?
Right.
Okay,
Okay,
thank you very much.
thank you.
Thank you.
And we'll meet in 5 minutes. This meeting's adjourned.